Now, on the 20th century.
You're just heartbroken watching your child lying there and knowing that she'll just never be the same again.
The right to die. Whose life is it, anyway? Who decides when and how life ends?
It's time for planned death. There's a great need for it everywhere.
I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. It began as a small story in an obscure New Jersey town, but by the time the case of Karen Ann Quinlan had been adjudicated, many Americans had been sent a wake-up call about what could happen as a result of modern medicine. In April of 1975, 21-year-old Karen Ann Quinlan fell into a permanent coma, the apparent result of mixing alcohol with tranquilizers. To keep her alive, doctors had hooked her up to a feeding tube and a respirator. But her parents, Julia and Joseph Quinlan, couldn't bear to see their daughter living that way, attached forever to hospital machines. They wanted to disconnect the respirator that was literally breathing for Karen Ann. In other words, they wanted simply to put their daughter's fate in God's hands.
When you see her just deteriorating like that, it just tears at your heart. So you're just heartbroken watching your child lying there and knowing that she'll just never be the same again. She'll just never run or laugh or talk or anything.
Physicians have told the parents that the girl has suffered irreparable brain damage due to lack of oxygen, and they say she will probably not survive for more than 6 months or a year, even in the respirator.
Karen Ann's plight created a vexing ethical dilemma for the hospital, which refused to disconnect the respirator that connected Karen Ann to life.
I think one of the important developments during the 1960s and 70s was to begin distinguishing between moral decisions and medical decisions.
Daniel Callahan, a medical ethicist from the Hastings Center, says that before the Quinlan case, the medical establishment usually made both decisions.
The initial reaction of the physicians to the Quinlan case was, look, here is a sick woman. She's in desperate condition. She's our patient. We make all the decisions. And the parents said, no, she's our daughter. We should have a right to step in and make a decision here about the matter.
The Quinlans wanted what they called death with dignity for Karen Ann, but the state of New Jersey called it murder. That set the stage for the legal battle that eventually wound up in court. The issue? Should Karen Ann be kept alive in a coma on a respirator, or should she be allowed to die if it was determined that she was what was known as brain dead?
Judge Robert Muir placed his emphasis on developing a definition of death and on determining factually Karen Quinlan's physical state. The court-appointed guardian spoke out for Karen's right to live. He said that there may be options other than turning off the respirator, such as turning on even more life support systems.
The Quinlans argued that they knew their daughter, knew her wishes, and were sure that she would not want to be kept alive by extraordinary means. But in ruling against the Quinlans, Judge Muir wrote, "The single most important temporal quality Karen Ann Quinlan has is life. This court will not authorize that life be taken from her." The Quinlans appealed to the New Jersey Supreme Court.
It got people talking and thinking about a difficult subject, and that subject was dying, or making choices about dying, or how do we die, and what kind of technology exists today that prevents us from dying when naturally we otherwise would have.
The Quinlan case revealed the dilemma of medical technology. Humans suddenly had more control over deciding when and how life ended, and ironically that frequently triggered more questions than answers.
Pullman Hospital in Houston, where they save lives first and ask questions later.
This is a 16-year-old young man who was involved in a motor vehicle accident last night and suffered a severe closed head injury of terrible consequences. His chance of survival, of a good survival, is perhaps 10%. He might require someone to feed him and clean him and do all his care activities on a 24-hour-a-day basis, either at home or in a nursing home.
Saved in the emergency room, patients can linger for months, unconscious, kept alive by machines.
The machines of medical technology had created a no-man's land between life and death, and patients like Karen Ann Quinlan were stranded there.
Medicine's ability to extend life is also the ability to impose additional suffering on us by the very effort to extend life. And that was, I think, a very troubling kind of insight. And it wasn't really until the Quinlan case came along, I think, that that point was really sort of punched in our face.
A year after Karen Ann lapsed into her coma, the New Jersey Supreme Court, in a landmark ruling, reversed the lower court's decision and awarded her parents the right to disconnect Karen's respirator.
The court held that Karen would never resume a cognitive life, and that Karen could not make the decision herself to live or die. That authority was given to her father.
Does this give Mr. Quinlan the right to end his daughter's life now?
What this gives Mr. Quinlan is the right for him to return his daughter to her natural processes, her body to her natural processes.
We had only one way to go. You know, there was no other decision to make. There was no alternatives. It was something that we felt we had to do, and we just had to do it.
What they ended up doing was forcing doctors and lawyers and courts and governments to re-examine philosophic questions. What is life, and when does it stop?
And as precious as life is, I think it's important to recognize that there is a time to end life, that there is a time to die, and that we must accept this also.
In the aftermath of the Karen Ann Quinlan case, many Americans became alarmed by the prospect that modern medical technology could be used to keep them or their loved ones alive in an unconscious, vegetative state for an indefinite period of time. To take that power away from physicians, they demanded the legal right to have a say over their treatment should something similar happen to them. And so in state after state, laws were adopted that made that possible through a document called a living will.
People with AIDS come to this house in Dallas to find shelter and comfort and to make the most difficult decisions of their lives.
Have you made preparations for death?
I've made out my living will.
Does it spell out what you want done if you get so sick that you can't make decisions?
Yes, my little brother has power of attorney to take over.
At 31, Jay has been sick for a year and a half. He wants to decide for himself under what conditions he should be kept alive.
I would like to live as long as I can if there be a chance. If there be a chance of recuperation. But like I said last night, if the doctor said there's no hope, then pull the plug. If I'm suffering and going through so much pain and agony.
That's why Jay has a living will, a will that spells out under what conditions medical treatment can be used to keep a patient alive. Living wills can also include a do not resuscitate order that mandates that a patient should not be brought back to life if the heart stops.
She's been on mechanical ventilation now for probably 2.5 to 3 months.
Dr. David Dansker discussing the case of Karen, a 31-year-old mother of 3 stricken with a rare brain disease last summer. She's deteriorated steadily ever since.
She has lots of areas for infection. She will get recurrent infections, and this will be a recurring theme until one of them is fatal.
In Karen's case, all she had was a do not resuscitate order, which said that if her heart stopped, she should not undergo cardiopulmonary resuscitation. But Karen's heart isn't the problem. It's her quality of life. That's why her doctor wants to change her medical orders to a less intense level of care. In his view, the disease is one. And his main concern now is to make Karen as comfortable as possible while she dies.
Well, she will die regardless of what we do. The difference will be how long she remains on a ventilator in the intensive care unit, not what the ultimate outcome was. That was explained to the family, and they're slow at coming to deal with that problem.
Karen's case was hardly unique. More and more frequently, doctors had the difficult, awkward task of persuading families to make those difficult medical decisions, decisions that, in effect, would terminate the life of a loved one. And that raised yet another disturbing question.
Do physicians try to manipulate families in order to help them to understand that they should give up?
I don't think manipulation is the right word. I think that what your job is to try to help the family understand the situation. You have a family who within 48 hours here had a 72-year-old individual who was alive, wonderful, had grandchildren, interacted with them, and like you said, he falls off an 8-foot ladder and suddenly it's over. 48 hours is a very short time in which to try to understand the fact that their loved one may never be the same.
But for the family of Paul Wink, it was time enough.
And you, I take it, would like to see your father, your husband, taken off the respirator?
If there's no hope, but if that's the only thing that's keeping him here.
He's not breathing for himself, then we don't think he's breathing. If the machine is breathing for him, that's not him breathing.
So you're saying to the doctors what?
Let him go when the Lord wants him.
Do not resuscitate.
No.
But what is a family to do when there is no respirator to disconnect, when a patient is breathing on her own and has no living will? That's just what happened to the family of Nancy Cruzan. In 1983, Nancy was found face down in a ditch by a Missouri state trooper after she had lost control of her car. The trooper pronounced her dead, but an ambulance crew that arrived afterwards brought her back to life, but not back to consciousness. In the hospital, she was fed by stomach tubes. Nancy Cruzan's eyes were open, but she was unaware of anything going on in the room.
The family wants so badly for the patient to wake up and goes to the bedside to see signs of consciousness, to see signs of interaction, and they don't see anything.
After 4 years of praying at their daughter's bedside, Nancy's parents finally decided there was no hope. So in 1987, they asked Nancy's doctors to recognize the first declaration of death, the one the state trooper made back at the accident scene. They wanted the feeding tube withdrawn.
It's something we feel like we have to carry out for her. Something that Nancy would ask, you know, this is the last thing that I'll ask of you, and I need your help.
When you finally decided what you were going to do, did you have any ambivalence about it?
The thoughts were more, I wish we didn't have to do this. And not to the extent that we don't have to do it, we can let her lie there, but that choice is not acceptable.
Nancy's doctors agreed there was no chance she would ever regain consciousness, but without a living will to guide them, they refused to disconnect the feeding tube that kept their patient alive. The Cruzans went to court, and the judge granted their wishes. But the state of Missouri appealed that decision and won.
This is not Big Brother staring down over the bed of Nancy Cruzan and saying, you must live. This may be the law saying, we don't know what you want. Maybe you want to live, and if we're going to make a mistake, that's the side we're going to come down on.
In other words, the court ruled, the Cruzan case was not about letting her die, it was about making her die. Was it ethical to withhold food and water to a patient, knowing she would starve to death, when there was no hope of her regaining consciousness? Nancy Cruzan's parents were willing to accept that responsibility.
Really, that's all we're asking for, is the right to stop a medical technology that began as a miracle and has turned into a nightmare.
I think after the Quinlan case, the Cruzan case was probably the most important, because it once again raised the issue of the care of the dying, the struggle between parents on the one hand and the hospital and legal authorities on the other.
The case was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, which sided with the state of Missouri against the Cruzan family.
The justices said each state can decide the life support issue for itself. Missouri can require Cruzan to stay on the feeding tube because she never prepared a living will, providing clear and convincing evidence that she would want to end medical treatment if she ever became incompetent.
The High Court ruling disappointed families with loved ones in the same condition as Nancy Cruzan, and it muddied the already murky waters for doctors who were dealing with life support cases.
In cases where a persistent vegetative state is even a possible outcome, some believe today's ruling will change dramatically how doctors behave, how they treat or don't treat.
This ties the hands of providers and in fact creates a major problem in ever starting treatment because we will be so afraid of ending up being unable to stop it.
Or in cases where treatment already has started, it may now be more likely to continue regardless.
I think physicians will be more reticent to withhold therapy unless there is some good documentation.
Despite the Supreme Court ruling, Nancy Cruzan's family continued to fight. Back in a Missouri courtroom, some of Nancy's former co-workers testified that Nancy had once told them she would not want to be kept alive if she were hooked up to machines. In the absence of a living will, the judge accepted that testimony as evidence of her wishes. So after a 3-year battle, the Cruzan family got the legal victory they needed to remove Nancy's feeding tube.
Nancy Cruzan, the woman at the center of the U.S. Supreme Court's first right to die case, died today.
Cruzan had been in deteriorating condition since a judge approved removal of her feeding tube 12 days ago. Protesters of that decision were still planning an emergency appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court today when her death was announced and the debate was renewed.
Nancy Cruzan did not die with dignity. She died a painful, slow, horrendous death.
She died with dignity, but the 7 years before, were cruelty. It's just the reverse.
Nancy Cruzan's case prompted a renewed outcry for more states to legalize living wills, especially since the Supreme Court had given states the authority to decide end-of-life issues. And lawmakers responded. By the end of 1990, the number of states that had living will laws had grown to 41. And in those states, more and more people began to draw up living wills.
Mattie Parker was never much worried about dying. She was worried about living too long, hooked to some machine. So last month, at 94, she signed a paper saying she did not want to be kept alive that way. About 30 days later, she fell and fractured her spine. Her son is relieved that she made her wishes known in time.
We would like to do everything we can, but if she's going to be permanently or a vegetable or permanently immobilized, no, she wouldn't want it, and I certainly don't want it.
California Health Decisions, this is Jennifer speaking.
Last June, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a state could keep a patient on life support devices unless the patient had clearly made his wishes known. Since then, organizations like California Health Decisions have been receiving about 1,000 calls a week, and workshops have been jammed with people intent on making their wishes known.
And new legislation was not limited to the states. In 1990, the federal government passed the Patient Self-Determination Act, which mandated that hospitals tell incoming patients about their rights under their own state laws.
Mickey Greer is checking into Baylor University Hospital in Dallas for a mastectomy, in itself a worrisome procedure.
Mrs. Greer, I need to explain a few things to you.
But first, she must confront an issue that may be even more frightening. What happens if she becomes so ill she cannot make decisions about her own treatment?
No one likes to face your own mortality, but when you go in the hospital, you're facing it.
The new federal law requires that all adults who enter a hospital or nursing home be told their rights under their own state law to choose or reject care. Then if they wish, it's not mandatory, they can leave what's known as an advance directive or living will.
The growing debate over medical technology and the end of life raised a host of troubling questions. Among them, what about the rights of the terminally ill? Or the rights of those in chronic pain? How much control did they have over their lives?
Meet Marjorie Ferran. By day, she works as a prison counselor here in Florence, Arizona. Sometimes at night, she wonders about her own death. She watched her mother die from suffocating emphysema. Then Ferran learned that she herself had cancer, now in remission. So Marjorie Ferran, a youthful, exuberant 63-year-old grandmother, decided to start storing up pills. She says just having them eases her greatest fear.
Just painful, slow, humiliating, expensive death. This is where I keep my supply in here.
way over in the corner here. And this is my collection.
How are you going to decide when to do this?
I think it will have to be when a doctor has told me that I am ill and there is no hope of recovery.
But what if you're wrong? What if it's too early?
Then I'll never know, will I?
Ruth Pierce's disease wasn't terminal, but it affected every facet of her life.
My illness was not destroying one life, it was destroying 4 lives. My husband, myself, and my 2 sons.
Ruth Pierce is not stockpiling drugs as an insurance policy for the distant future. Ruth Pierce is stockpiling drugs for a day that she says may be soon. She has already fought a 10-year battle with searing pain from a rare progressive nerve disease that has left her paralyzed and nearly blind. She is not sure how much more she can take. Pierce used to be an active and vital woman, and ironically, a practical nurse. She has already turned once to her stockpile. She regrets her first attempt at suicide didn't work.
The disease is not terminal.
No, the disease is not terminal. I will die from something else. So shall I tell you what I pray for each night? I pray that tomorrow morning maybe I'll wake up and have cancer. It'll be quicker over with. This is what is known as my private hoard, my private stock, whichever you wish to call it. It's my 50 pills that I have set aside that I hope, if and when I do it, will do the trick this time.
People have become much more aware of some of the unpleasant possibilities of death with modern medicine. And I think the net result has been development of more fear on the part of people.
Doctor-assisted suicide has been a fact for centuries. It was a common practice in ancient Greece where it was called euthanasia, or mercy killing. Oddly enough, that was also the culture that gave us Hippocrates and the sacred Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm to patients. Well, there's at least one American doctor who sees no conflict in that seeming contradiction. To Dr. Jack Kevorkian, assisting severely afflicted people to commit suicide does no harm because he believes those individuals have a right to put an end to their suffering.
When do you decide that this person probably would be best to go?
Well, actually, the patient decides when it's best to go.
But is he or she a good judge?
Only on what he or she wants. As a medical doctor, it is my duty to evaluate the situation with as much data as I can gather and as much expertise as I have and as much experience as I have to determine whether or not the wish of the patient is medically justified.
Once he had made that justification, Dr. Kevorkian also provided the means, the so-called suicide machine. And it was with that machine in June of 1990 that Dr. Kevorkian helped the first of many patients to take her own life.
The patient reaches over and just touches that switch once.
Dr. Jack Kevorkian, like an angel of death, is proud he just helped a woman commit suicide.
It's time for planned death. There's a great need for it everywhere.
With that mission, he arranged yesterday for Janet Adkins of Portland, Oregon, an Alzheimer's victim, to end her life at age 54. She contacted Kevorkian, a retired Detroit area pathologist, after learning of his device for hopelessly ill patients, one that dispenses through intravenous tubes a drug which causes heart seizure and painless death within minutes.
Janet Adkins didn't die in a clinic or a hospital. Dr. Kevorkian had taken her instead to a remote county park and in the back of his van attached her to his death machine. He said it was she who willingly pushed the suicide button.
She came to you and said, "Doctor, I want to commit suicide."
Absolutely, right to the last, and almost kissed me when I bent over and said, are you getting sleepy? She says, "Yes, thank you," and reached up trying to kiss me.
People said they were thankful for Kevorkian's help in assisting their suicides because they said they believed he understood their fears.
The fear of pain and the fear of dying painfully is a powerful motivator.
I think what we were fearful was that we were going to have one of these unpleasant deaths. They might not be able to relieve our pain or relieve our suffering, and we would simply have a long, extended, very unpleasant death. And people said, why should I put up with that? Why couldn't I have it cut short and die more pleasantly?
In helping Janet Adkins end her life, Dr. Kevorkian also confounded Michigan authorities. Murder charges would not stand up in court. After all, the doctor didn't cause Adkins' death. So authorities slapped Kevorkian with a court order not to do it again. But then, about a year later, he did it again.
Risking murder charges but making good on a promise, Michigan's controversial suicide doctor Jack Kevorkian says he has helped 2 more women take their own lives. The retired pathologist led police to a secluded one-room cabin in the woods north of Detroit to the bodies of 58-year-old Marjorie Wantz and 43-year-old Sherry Miller.
It was Kevorkian's growing reputation as Dr. Death that had caused Marjorie Wantz to seek him out. And she talked about what she wanted in an interview shortly before her death.
Because I don't want to live anymore. Not like this.
In constant pain from a pelvic disease, she announced 2 months ago she wanted Kevorkian's help.
And it's just not worth it.
And so too a year ago, Sherry Miller, mother of 2, unable to move from 12 years of crippling multiple sclerosis, she begged to die.
You know, if I gotta live the rest of my life like this, no thank you.
Despite a court order barring him from using his suicide device, Kevorkian granted their wish, even declaring his intentions in an interview 3 weeks ago.
Are you planning to use this on future patients?
Yes, when it's necessary. It's my obligation as a physician. I don't impose my philosophy or religious principles on somebody else. I'm a doctor.
Kevorkian may have been a doctor, but after the deaths of Marjorie Wantz and Sherry Miller, the State Board of Medicine revoked his license to practice medicine in Michigan. But murder charges for the Wantz and Miller deaths were dismissed. As Kevorkian continued to assist suicides, he generated a growing backlash from religious leaders and right-to-life activists.
He is a medical vulture. He preys on the weak and needy to put forward an agenda which undercuts the very fabric of our society. Our culture is built that all life has dignity.
What he is doing is some of the most vile, evil, detestable stuff that's happening in this country today.
The medical establishment also expressed its disapproval.
I think we want to offer what medical science has. We need to chastise ourselves a bit for not controlling their pain and spending enough time in compassion care, but I don't think assisted suicide is the answer.
By the end of 1992, Kevorkian had assisted in 8 suicides. Time and again, he eluded Michigan prosecutors who couldn't make murder charges stick. But in December of 1992, state authorities came up with a new weapon, a special law aimed at just one man, Dr. Jack Kevorkian.
The legislature has just made doctor-assisted suicide, known as medicide, a criminal offense. And today the governor of Michigan signed it into law.
But even that was not enough. Kevorkian continued to assist suicides while the new law's constitutionality was being challenged in the Michigan courts.
If we own anything in this state, in this country, we certainly own our bodies. And the government has no more right to tell us when we can go to the bathroom or tell me when I can wear this color tie than it does to tell me how much suffering I have to undergo before I die.
In June of 1993, 6 months after Michigan's governor signed the new law, the Court of Appeals ordered it into effect while the appeals process went forward. 2 months later, Thomas Hyde was found dead in Kevorkian's van, and Kevorkian was ordered to stand trial for Hyde's death. Dr. Kevorkian, released on his own recognizance, assisted in 3 more deaths. When arrested for one of them, he refused to post a $50,000 bond, and he went on a jailhouse hunger strike instead.
Dr. Jack Kevorkian is out of prison tonight, but says he will not assist in any more suicides, at least for the time being. Kevorkian came to court on the 18th day of a hunger strike. The county judge lowered his bail to $100 after the doctor promised he would not help anyone else to die until the issue is resolved by higher courts.
But in the spring of 1994, even though the constitutionality of the Michigan law had not been decided, Kevorkian went on trial for assisting a suicide, and the jury acquitted him.
In the first trial under Michigan's ban on assisted suicide, a Detroit jury found Dr. Jack Kevorkian not guilty, even though the retired pathologist admitted that he provided the mask and the carbon monoxide that 30-year-old Thomas Hyde used to end his life last August.
Several jurors said they were touched by Hyde's suffering from the final stages of Lou Gehrig's disease. Instead of voting purely on the merits of assisted suicide, though, the jurors seemed to cling to a loophole which Kevorkian and his attorney exploited.
I believe that he did this to relieve this man's pain and suffering, even though it was wrong to help someone to commit suicide. He convinced us that he was not a murderer, that he was really trying to help people out.
The Michigan Court of Appeals is currently reviewing that state's controversial suicide law, but legal scholars believe that whatever happens to Jack Kevorkian, the U.S. Supreme Court will ultimately decide whether or not physician-assisted suicide is legal.
In December of 1994, 7 months after Kevorkian was acquitted in the Hyde death, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the assisted suicide law was indeed constitutional. So Kevorkian was charged and tried again and yet again. And in those two cases as well, he was found not guilty.
Did you really seriously worry about going to prison?
No, never. Am I a criminal? The world knows I'm not a criminal. What are they trying to put me in jail for? You've lost common sense in this society because of religious fanaticism and dogma. You're basing your laws and your whole outlook on natural life on mythology. It won't work. That's why you have all these problems in the world. Name them. India, Pakistan, Ireland. Name them. All these problems. They're all religious problems.
You don't seem to feel very strongly about this issue, do you? What do you do for fun, Dr. Kevorkian?
Irritate people.
While Kevorkian was irritating Michigan lawmakers and flouting Michigan law, the state of Oregon was moving in the opposite direction. In 1994, Oregon voters passed Measure 16, the nation's first law legalizing doctor-assisted suicide.
Under Oregon's law, the doctor must not be directly involved. He may only write the prescription for a lethal dose. The patient must take it himself and must have less than 6 months to live. Opponents say such safeguards are futile, that ultimately suicide will become an option for everyone.
This is the first breach in the barrier. Up until now, it's been illegal, tolerated sometimes, winked at sometimes, but it was illegal. And indeed, with the exception of Holland, it's the only other place in the world where it is legal.
And for some people in Oregon, legalizing physician-assisted suicide was a comfort to Jean Yukich, who learned that she had inoperable lung cancer nearly a year before the law was passed.
So you're still hoarding pills?
Well, I stopped when I got the news that that measure had passed. I was so elated. I mean, it was just like somebody lifted a weight off my shoulders. I thought, I don't have to do this. You know, there's hope out there. You know, there's something to resort to.
But if doctors told you, said, look, we can make you comfortable, and we can make it so you don't feel that you're suffocated, you still wouldn't consider it?
No, I won't let myself get to that point. I wouldn't let my animal get to that point.
But Oregon stood alone in its support of assisted suicide. Similar measures were rejected in California and Washington. Meanwhile, 35 other states followed Michigan's lead and banned assisted suicide. In 1997, the United States Supreme Court upheld Oregon's law by refusing to hear an appeal that had kept the Oregon law from going into effect. But in a separate decision, the High Court also upheld state laws against assisted suicide, ruling that Americans had no constitutional right to die.
No one, they said, has the right to seek a doctor-assisted suicide. Fittingly, it was Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who watched his own wife Natalie die after a long battle with cancer, who wrote the decision. The asserted right to assistance in committing suicide is not a fundamental liberty, he wrote. At the American Medical Association, doctors were relieved.
To actively take a patient's life in assisted suicide is against all of the principles of medical ethics.
It is a fine line, the justices admitted, but one we must not cross. Treat the pain, comfort the afflicted, they seem to suggest, but don't play God.
In the mid-1970s, around the time the Karen Ann Quinlan case was stirring public attention in America, a British journalist named Derek Humphrey made a promise to his dying wife. He vowed that when the end was near, he would help her take her own life, which he ultimately did. And later he wrote a book about the experience called Jean's Way, and I talked to him about that. On the day that Jean died, on the day that you helped her take her life, she simply asked you, "Is this the day?" She asked you.
Yes, right.
And you answered, "Yes, my darling, it is." How did you know it was the day?
I knew from talking to the doctors the previous day that she was very close to death. I knew there was no cure. I also sensed that she was ready to die.
What did the state say to you when you aided and abetted your wife's suicide?
After 3 months, the public prosecutor decided not to prosecute me. And he said there was insufficient grounds of evil intent or malice. And he just did not take me to court. I believe and I campaign nowadays for the right to assist a death on request between rational, intelligent people.
His personal campaign led Derek Humphrey to start the Hemlock Society in 1980, and the organization promoting right-to-die issues quickly grew in size. About 10 years later, Humphrey wrote a book called Final Exit, a how-to manual that explained how to commit pain-free, effective suicide, or to help someone else do it. By this time, Dr. Jack Kevorkian and his suicide machine were causing a sensation. And in that climate, Final Exit became a runaway bestseller.
When there's no good way to assure people that they won't be lying there suffering on machines, you're desperate. And if there's a book that's going to help you figure out what to do if, God forbid, you're ever in that situation, you're going to read it.
But the instructions in Final Exit were not flawless. Things could and did go wrong. That was the case when Bill Meyer agreed to help end the life of his cancer-stricken father.
He read Derek Humphrey's book, Final Exit, and it described in there the most painless, quick, efficient way to do it was to take some sleeping pills and put a plastic bag over your head so you die in your sleep. The kind of bag you'd buy at the grocery store. And then you put a rubber band, tighten it around the neck. So that means air will not come out, yeah. Very difficult.
Why use a bag? Why not just a lot of pills?
They say you would upchuck the pills.
As previously agreed, Bill did not stay with his father to the very end. Instead, he spent the night in a motel. Next morning, he returned to his father's house.
When I came back the next morning, Mike, he was waking up. And what a shock.
Still in the bag?
No, he pushed the bag off during the night. That's his conditioned reflex. And latched the bag from his head. He was waking up. He's very, very drowsy, of course, shaking his head. And he looked at me and he says, "Bill, the biggest decision of my life, I failed." And believe me, we hugged each other. I mean, we just grabbed each other and hugged each other. You know, we both cried.
Bill's father convinced him they should try again. But this time, Bill stayed on, holding down his father's arms, stopping his father's reflex to pull the plastic bag off his head. You didn't feel that you were killing him?
No, I felt I was liberating my father.
A judge in Hartford, Connecticut sentenced Bill to 2 years probation. Judge Thomas Miano said that he did not condone assisted suicide, but because of the unique circumstances of the case, he didn't feel that Bill Meyer should go to prison.
I suspect in the end the question is how much suffering should you be prepared to bear in life? That's a very large question which affects a lot of things we do in life, and that's combined with the question of, and to what extent should we look to medicine to relieve us of the suffering?
For some terminally ill patients, the answer to those questions was to reject the choices of committing suicide or suffering in hospitals with high-tech medicine. Instead, they preferred to die at home.
John Graham is dying of cancer. No more operations or radiation or chemotherapy can cure him. He has chosen to stop fighting and go home.
So I just said that's it. I'll take it as it comes right now.
No heroics down here, no IVs.
Whenever the time's right, then just that's when he'll go.
Instead, they are choosing a kind of care which emphasizes pain relief and staying at home, a philosophy called hospice.
I think the latest figures are something in the vicinity of 350,000 people, roughly 15% of those who die every year die in the company of hospice programs.
In the Middle Ages, hospice was a way station for weary travelers on trips to faraway lands. The modern concept of hospice was founded in the 1960s at St. Christopher's Hospice in London, England.
It's the opposite of depressing, it's the opposite of acute care hospitals, it's the opposite of sad. It is a place in which life is being lived and lived to its fullest.
The hospice movement took hold in America in the mid-70s in Brantford, Connecticut, right about the time that Karen Ann Quinlan's parents were fighting to let their daughter die.
The person who has chosen hospice seems to be saying, I know what's going to happen to me, I'm going to die. However, I want to remain a person, I want to remain a human being, I want my dignity, I want to live until I die.
For many, that's what hospice meant, a dignified approach to death.
Judith Sales is a hospice of Tacoma nurse who makes daily rounds. She teaches families or friends how to relieve pain, administer other medications, and otherwise make dying patients more comfortable.
Have you found any of those exercises to be useful and relaxing when your chest gets tight?
Yeah, they got me on some medication now that makes me relax.
Hospice workers are experts at giving and teaching medical help, as well as at handling the various emotional stages of approaching death. They must learn to deal sensitively with those patients who deny they are dying.
It's been successful primarily because they are very effective in relieving pain and dealing with the psychological and spiritual suffering of people. They have a very good reputation for their effectiveness.
The hospice movement may be effective in easing the psychological and spiritual pain of dying. But there is no simple pill or panacea that deals with the confusion and the dread that affects many of those who face end-of-life decisions. And just as it was in Karen Ann Quinlan's time, the decision on what to do remains both a medical decision and a moral one.
It's a very hard call, and it puts patients and families in a tough situation, and it's a very difficult matter for doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals to grapple with.
Modern medicine has changed the equation enormously, but in the end, modern medicine can't keep us from dying, can't keep us from getting sick, can't keep us from going through some degree of pain. It can forestall it, put it off, change the conditions. It's a kind of shell game, make things a little bit better, a little bit later, but we still have bodies that are finite, that get old, that die, and that's probably the way it will always be.
Thanks in large part to great achievements in medical science, we are now living longer than ever. What was considered old age 50 years ago is now routinely regarded as middle age. And as we continue to extend the frontier of aging, end-of-life issues will loom even larger. And moreover, for those who become afflicted with debilitating illness, there will be even more sophisticated technology that can be used to prolong their lives in a passive state that many would consider undesirable. In short, the ethical dilemmas that caused so much consternation in the latter part of the 20th century will continue as we move into the next millennium. The major difference is that more and more people will have to confront those dilemmas. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.